Two old ladies. The winter days at Susan's passed slowly and gently, like leaves falling from trees. Every morning I woke in the kitchen, in my bed by the radiator. I always woke before Susan came downstairs, and I would roll over and lie on my teddy until I heard Susan's footsteps. When Susan entered the kitchen, she would greet me with pats and kisses and chin scratches, and then she would make our breakfast: dog food for me, toast and eggs for her, and fruit for her. She always gave me a bite of warm eggs, though. In the mornings, I kept Susan company while she was busy at her desk or with her sewing or puttering around the house. Sometimes she talked on the telephone. Sometimes one of her friends would stop by and Susan would fix tea. Susan made sure to walk me around the house every so often, and each time I relieved myself outdoors, she gave me a cookie. During the first few days I was at Susan's, I relieved myself indoor a couple times, and Susan would show me those spots and say, "No cookie, Addie." Then she would clean the spots with something in a white bottle, and eventually I understood that I was not to relieve myself indoors. I also understood that Susan would make sure I went outdoors often enough so that I wasn't uncomfortable. At lunchtime, Susan ate a small meal in her kitchen. I did not get a meal at lunch anymore, although Susan usually gave me a bite of hers. In the afternoon, Susan and I would climb in the car and run errands together. My favorite places to visit were Pet Town and the bakery. Susan always brought me into Pet Town with her, and sometimes someone in there would give me a treat. In the evening, Susan and I ate dinner in the kitchen. Afterward, Susan usually worked at her sewing or read a book. We would sit together on the couch. If possible, I would rest my head in Susan's lap. I had been living at Susan's for a while. I wasn't exactly sure how long because I was less aware of the shape of the moon than I had been when I lived outside, when the doorbell rang one morning and Susan exclaimed, "Goodness! Now, who could that be? I'm not expecting anybody." Susan had been sorting through some cartons that she had brought into the living room from another part of the house. She left them on the floor and called, "Who is it?" as she hurried to the front door. "It's Mrs. Oliver," I heard someone reply. I watched Susan. She stopped walking, stood very still in the hallway, closed her eyes for a few seconds, and muttered, "Oh, drat," then opened the door. "Hello, Mrs. Oliver," said Susan. "Hello, dear." A stout woman stepped into the hallway, tracking snow in after her. "Would you like to take off your boots?" Susan asked, looking at the wet marks on the carpet. Oh, yes, of course. It's still so chilly out there," said Mrs. Oliver, and she stooped down to slip off her boots. "I don't know how you're managing out here all by yourself in the cold." Susan looked perplexed. "I have a furnace," she said. Mrs. Oliver's face colored. "I meant with the shoveling and driving and all." "Oh, Mac is still coming by to shovel me out, just like always," said Susan. "And they do seem to plow the roads quickly nowadays, so quickly nowadays. I never have to wait long before I can get out." Mrs. Oliver had removed her coat. She hung it in the closet in the hall. Then she stepped into the living room. "Why, Susan, I see you're getting ready for Christmas. That's lovely. How did you get all these boxes in here?" "I carried them," said Susan. "I can still—" "My heavens, what on earth is that?" Mrs. Oliver interrupted her. She was pointing at me. "It's a dog." "Well, I know it's a dog, dear. I meant, what is it doing here? Her name is Addie, and this is her home." "Oh, Susan." Mrs. Oliver looked deeply disappointed, as if Susan had chewed up a couch cushion. "Now, how are you going to manage a dog? Where did she come from, anyway?" "She'd been hanging around the house, and she was nearly frozen to death. But I've been taking her to Skip, and she has a clean bill of health." Mrs. Oliver didn't seem to be listening. She had bent down and was running her hand through the carpet. "What?" Susan began to say. "I'm just checking for flea dirt." "Flea dirt? Psst!" Susan looked disgusted. "Addie does not have fleas." She paused. "And she does not have ear mites either, or the mange. She's in perfect health. She's just old." "And so are you," replied Mrs. Oliver, standing up. "Really, my dear, how are you going to take care of this dog? She's too large for you to pick up, and she's decrepit. Is she even housebroken?" "Of course she's housebroken." Mrs. Oliver sniffed. "Well, I'll admit that the house smells fine." Susan stared after her. After a moment, Mrs. Oliver turned away from Susan and approached me. I was curled up on the couch. "She seems a nice enough dog," Mrs. Oliver said finally. "But really, Susan, have you thought this through? An old dog is only going to get harder to care for. What are you going to do if she can't walk, or if she becomes incontinent? If you ask me, you should take her to the shelter and let them find a home for her with younger people." Susan drew herself up straight. "Mrs. Oliver," she began, "Addie is good company." "I'm sure that's true. And furthermore," Susan hesitated. "Furthermore, oh my, it's starting to snow. You should probably be on your way before the roads get too slippery. Mrs. Oliver glanced aside. All right, but dear, I suggest you think about what I said. Susan planted herself in front of Mrs. Oliver and said firmly, I will do no such thing. Addie is here to stay. Then she crossed through the hallway and held the door open while Mrs. Oliver slipped into her coat and boots again and stepped onto the porch. Have a good, Mrs. Oliver said, but Susan had already closed the door. She turned to look at me. Hateful woman, she exclaimed, and I thought she said it rather loudly. She returned to the living room and sat next to me on the couch. Did you understand any of that, Addie? She asked, stroking my nuzzle. I hope not, but if you did, I want to assure you that I have no intention of taking you to the shelter. You're mine and I'm yours, and this is our home. That night, Susan put me to bed in the kitchen as usual, and for a while I lay by the radiator and gazed outside. The moon must have been full because Susan's yard was lit up, and I could see the new snow coating the tree branches. Suddenly, without knowing I was going to do so, I stood up stiffly and walked to the bottom of the staircase. I looked up. The second story seemed far away, and I wasn't used to stairs, although I'd climbed Susan's once or twice. I let out a sigh before I began to make my way up the steps. I knew where Susan's bedroom was, and when I reached it, I nosed through the partially open door, then stood on my hind legs and peered into the bed. Susan stirred, but she didn't seem surprised to see me. Hello, old lady, she said. What are you doing up here? You should be in your own bed. I stared at Susan for a few more seconds, then dropped to all fours and attempted to jump into the bed. It was very high, though, and I slipped back to the floor. Oh, dear, said Susan. She was as stiff as I was, and she moved slowly, and as she pushed back the covers, hung her legs over the side of the bed and finally stood beside me. Come on back downstairs. I didn't move. Susan smiled. Oh, all right, she said. She shoved a footstool next to me. Here, use this. She coaxed me onto the stool and placed my front paws on the bed. I jumped. Susan shoved my rump up, and the next thing I knew, I was crawling under the covers, and Susan was climbing in beside me. We slept together all night, and that is how we have spent every night since then.